Section 21 of Lives of the Queens of England, Volume 4, by Agnes and Elisabeth Strickland. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Anne Boulay. Catherine Howard, Chapter 1, Part 2. It is impossible to ascertain the date of Catherine's first appearance at court, but it has been generally said that she made a conquest of her sovereign at a banquet given by the Bishop of Winchester to his royal master a few months after his marriage with Anne of Cleves. When Gardiner observed the impression made by the charms and sprightly wit of the fair niece of his patron, the Duke of Norfolk, he contrived that the king should have frequent opportunities of seeing her at his house. Catherine was exquisitely graceful in her manners and deportment, but so remarkably small, that Richard Hill, in a contemporary letter, in which he details the news of the court to his friend Bullinger, says, "The king is going to part with the queen, that he may be married to Mrs. Howard, a very little girl." Hill describes Catherine also as a young person, the niece of the Duke of Norfolk, and specifies midsummer as the time when it began to be whispered that the king was much taken with her, that they had met several times at the house of Gardiner, and that scandal was already busy on the subject of the fickle monarch's passion for the miniature beauty in her teens. The date of Catherine Howard's appointment as maid of honour to Anne of Cleves is uncertain, but it probably took place at the time when the queen was deprived of her foreign attendants, and the strange maidens were superseded by some of the noble belles of Henry's court. The arrangement that added the new object of the sovereign's regard to the establishment of his despised consort was of course of his own ordaining, as it afforded him the gratification of her society in his own royal circle, as well as in his more private hours of relaxation, and thus we see him, for the third time, the avowed lover of a favourite maid of honour. How far his addresses were encouraged by the youthful beauty is not known. She seems to have behaved with greater propriety than either Anne Boleyn or Jane Seymour under similar circumstances, for no one has accused her of treating the queen with disrespect, or presuming to assume airs of state in rivalry to her. It has been very generally asserted, but on what grounds no one has specified, that Catherine permitted herself to be rendered a political puppet in the hands of Gardiner and her uncle Norfolk, to further their measures against the cause of the Reformation, and that Cromwell, dreading the effects of her influence, spake of her in very disadvantageous terms to the king, in order to dissuade him from making her his queen. There is great probability in this statement, but that Cromwell's death was attributable to the ill offices of the offended beauty requires proof, for there is not the slightest contemporary evidence, not so much as a private letter, to bear out the assertions of Burnet and Rapin, that she prevailed on the king to sign the death warrant of his fallen minister. Catherine Howard neither possessed the talents, the energy, nor the vindictive temper of her cousin, Anne Boleyn. Her intrigues were not those of state policy. And as for her subserviency to her uncle Norfolk's wishes, his letters to the king are a sufficient refutation of that report. After Catherine's removal to court, Durham vanished so entirely from the scene that no one knew whether he was living or dead. This was an auspicious circumstance for Catherine, but her grandmother, whose share of wisdom was certainly small, could not control the absurd curiosity which prompted her to inquire of her domestics if any of them knew what had become of Francis Durham. They replied, that none of them knew. "Then," said the duchess, "if any one knows where he is, belike it will be Catherine Howard." Soon after these inquiries, Catherine, who was then one of the maidens of the court, came to pay her grandmother a visit, and the old lady was guilty of the folly of reviving his apparently forgotten name, by asking her, if she knew where he was? Catherine replied, that she did not know where he was become. Some years had passed away since the guilt was incurred which had cast so dark a cloud over the hopes and expectations of that period of existence which is generally the golden age of life. Those years had probably been fraught with repentance and bitter regret for her fault, and if they had not led to amendment of life, which charity would lead us to hope, The change in her deportment was so decided that she was remarkable for her maidenly and modest behaviour, which, as Henry afterwards declared, formed her greatest attraction in his sight. Marillac, in a letter to Francis I, dated the 21st of July, thus speaks of the reports connected with Henry's engagement to Catherine. Now it is said that the king is going to marry a lady of great beauty, daughter to a deceased brother of the Duke of Norfolk. It is even said that the marriage has already taken place, but is kept secret. I cannot tell how far it is true. In a letter to the Constable Montmorency of the same date, he adds, that he has heard the lady is not only married to the king, but likely to bring him a family. The old Duchess of Norfolk took infinite pains to secure the royal alliance for her fair young protégée. She bestowed costly array and jewels on her to enhance her native attractions, and it is said that she instructed her in what manner to demean herself to the king's highness so as to please him. She was even guilty of the folly of commending Catherine to the king as a person worthy of the honour of becoming his wife and one calculated to promote his happiness. If Catherine had flattered herself with the idea that because so many years had passed away since her early misconduct had occurred, that it was forgotten, she must have been undeceived when she received the following letter from one of her former unprincipled confidants, the person through whose assistance she had carried on a clandestine and forbidden correspondence with her seducer. Joan Bulmer to Catherine Howard. If I could wish unto you all the honour, wealth, and good fortune you could desire, you would neither lack health, wealth, long life, nor yet prosperity. Nevertheless, seeing I cannot, as I would, express this unto you, I would with these my most heartily salutations pite you to know, that whereas it hath been shown unto me that God of his high goodness hath put unto the knowledge of the king a contract of matrimony that the queen hath made with another before she came into England, and thereupon there will be a lawful divorce had between them, and as it is thought that the king of his goodness will put you in the same honour that she was in, which no doubt you be worthy to have, most heartily desiring you to have in your remembrance the unfeigned love that my heart hath always borne towards you, which for the same kindness found in you again hath desired always your presence, if it might be so, above all other creatures, and the chance of fortune that hath brought me, on the contrary, into the utmost misery of the world and most wretched life. Seeing no ways, then, I can express in writing, knowing no remedy out of it without you, of your goodness, will find the means to get me to London, which will be very hard to do. But if you write unto my husband, and command him to bring me up, which I think he dare not disobey, for if it might be, I would fain be with you before you were in your honour, and in the mean season I beseech you to save some room for me, what you shall think fit for yourself, for the nearer I were to you, the gladder I would be of it, what pains soever I did take. I would write more unto you, but I dare not be so bold, for considering the great honour you are toward, it did not become me to put myself in presence, but the remembrance of the perfect honesty that I have always known to be in you, and the report of Sir John Seaford, which hath assured me that the same thing remains in you still, hath encouraged me to this. Whereupon I beseech you not to be forgetful of this my request, for if you do not help me, I am not like to have worldly joys, desiring you, if you can, to let me have some answer of this for the satisfying of my mind, for I know the Queen of Britain will not forget her secretary, and favour you will show. Your humble servant, with heart unfeigned, Joan Bulmer. York, the 12th day of July. The letter of Joan Bulmer was only the foretaste of what Catherine had to expect as the fruits of her early follies. No sooner was the rumour of the king's divorce from his new queen, combined with the report of his passion for her, spread abroad, than she found herself beset with those persons whom, of all the world, it was most to her interest to have kept at a distance. The evil spirits who had departed from her for a season returned to harass and intimidate her with demands which she wanted the moral courage to withstand. In fact, she had no power to extricate herself from these perils and degrading connections, unless she had revealed her former misconduct to the king. But even if Catherine had been permitted by her family to make such a disclosure to her royal lover, she was placed in a predicament that left her only the alternative of becoming a queen or confessing her own shame. She chose the first. Durham, meantime, through long perdue, was not ignorant of the king's passion for his betrothed, for in allusion to it, he said to one of his former comrades, "I could be sure of Mistress Howard, and I would, but I dare not. The king beginneth to love her, but an he were dead, I am sure I might marry her." This speech leads to the conclusion that he was induced to waive his prior claim to the fair object of his sovereign's choice, and it is more than probable that the old Duchess of Norfolk was the person who prevailed upon him to remain quiescent, and if so, this would account for the otherwise inscrutable mystery of that lady's conduct in tolerating his presence, and even allowing him to take up his abode in her house a second time, after his misconduct with the young Katherine. The public announcement of the dissolution of Henry's marriage with Anne of Cleves was followed by a petition from his servile parliament, beseeching him, for the good of his people, to venture on a fifth marriage, in the hope that God would bless him with a more numerous issue. The nuptials of the royal Bluebeard of English history with Catherine Howard were privately solemnized within a few days, or it might be a few hours, after he was released from his marriage vows to Anne of Cleves. Some persons, as for instance Marillac, the French ambassador, supposed he did not wait for that ceremony. It seems strange that no particulars of the solemnization of Henry's fifth marriage have ever been brought to light. The day, the hour, the witnesses, and the person by whom the nuptial benediction was pronounced are not on record. But on the 8th of August, 1540, Catherine Howard was introduced by Henry at Hampton Court as his queen. On that day she took her seat at chapel in the royal closet by Henry's side. She afterwards dined in public, on which occasion she placed her youngest stepdaughter, the Princess Elisabeth, opposite to herself at table, and always gave her the place of honour next to her own person, because she was the daughter of her cousin Anne Boleyn. On the 15th of August, Catherine was publicly prayed for throughout the realm as Queen of England. This is particularly noticed by Marillac, who says, "The king, the queen, and the child Edward, Prince of England, were prayed for in all the churches, the new queen's name having superseded that of the repudiated Princess of Cleves." No surprise is testified by any contemporary at this alliance as derogatory to the king. A close connection already existed between the royal family and Catherine's, in consequence of the former marriage between her uncle, the present Duke of Norfolk, when Lord Thomas Howard, with the king's aunt, the Lady Anne Plantagenet. As Catherine Howard was first cousin to Henry's second wife, Anne Boleyn, their marriage required a dispensation from the Pope, both parties being Catholic. But Henry, in his new character of head of the church, thought proper to dispense with this ceremony. This marriage was the first ever contracted between persons so connected, without previously obtaining the papal sanction, and it formed the precedent for all others. Henry had taken care to prepare for the legality of the contract by a previous act of parliament, concerning marriages within certain degrees, which bore upon the case. A few days after Henry had acknowledged Catherine for his queen, he conducted her to Windsor, where they remained till the 22nd of August. They then made a little progress to Reading, Eulham, Rycott, Notley, Buckingham, and Grafton. At Grafton, the royal bride and bridegroom sojourned from August 29th till September 7th. The absence of all records of pageantry and processions would indicate that the enamoured monarch had been desirous of enjoying the society of his young queen in the retirement of the country, unfettered by the observations and restraints of royal etiquette. Henry's finances at this period were at a low ebb. The expenses of his pompous nuptials with his unbeloved Flemish bride and his subsequent gifts and settlements on her had completely exhausted all his resources. He could neither afford to honour Catherine Howard with a public bridal nor a coronation, but he paid her the compliment of causing gold coins to be struck in commemoration of their marriage, bearing the royal arms of England, flanked with HR and surmounted with the royal diadem. On the reverse is a rose, crowned, in allusion to his bride, flanked by the initials K.R., with the following legend: Henricus opt, rutilans rosa sine spina. The rose, which Henry, in the first transports of his short-lived passion for his Howard queen, chose for her symbol, makes a conspicuous figure in the augmentation which he granted to her armorial bearings in honour of her marriage. Among the unedited manuscripts in the State Paper Office we find a list of the officers of state and ladies of Queen Catherine Howard's royal household. The ladies were those of the highest rank in the kingdom, and some of them members of the royal family. The great ladies of the Queen's household. The Lady Margaret Douglas, niece to the King. The Duchess of Richmond, daughter-in-law to the King and cousin to the Queen. The Duchess of Norfolk, Catherine Willoughby, fourth wife to Charles Brandon, the King's brother-in-law. The Countess of Sussex, the Lady Howard, the Lady Clinton. Ladies of the Privy Chamber. The Countess of Rutland, the Lady Rochford, Lady Edgecombe, Lady Baynton. Gentlewomen of the Privy Chamber. Mrs. Herbert, Mrs. Tyrwhitt, Mrs. Lee, Mrs. Gilman. Chamberers. Mrs. Tilney, Mrs. Morton, Mrs. Fryswith, Mrs. Lufkin. Ladies and gentlewomen attendant. The Lady Dudley, Lady Arundel, the Queen's sister. Lady Dennis, Lady Wriothesley, Lady Heneage, Lady Knevet, Lady Cromwell, sister to the deceased Queen Jane Seymour. Mrs. Mewtas, Mrs. Broughton. Maids of honour. The Lady Lucy, Mrs. Bassett, Mrs. Garnish, Mrs. Calpladike, Mrs. Stradling, Mrs. Strawner. A list of yeomen ushers, yeomen of the chambers in ordinary, pages of the chambers, and pages in ordinary, follows. The names of the officers of the household are not of any particular interest. Her chaplains were Doctors Mollett and Oglethorpe. The latter held the office of almoner to her predecessor, Anne of Cleves. Sir Thomas Denys was her chancellor at first, but afterwards superseded by her sister's husband, Sir Thomas Arundel. The historians of this period bear universal testimony to the passionate fondness of the king for his new consort. Marillac, the French ambassador, who had enjoyed the opportunity of paying his compliments to the royal pair on their marriage, gives the following lively sketch of Catherine's appearance in her bridal court, and Henry's demeanour to her, in a letter to his own sovereign, Francis I, dated September 3, 1540. The new queen is a young lady of moderate beauty, but superlative grace. In stature she is small and slender. Her countenance is very delightful, of which the king is so greatly enamoured, that he knows not how to make sufficient demonstrations of his affection for her, and very far exceeds the caresses he ever bestowed on the others. She is dressed after the French fashion, like all the other ladies of the court, and bears for her device round her arms, Non altre volonté, que le sienne. No other will than his. The expression beauté médiocre, which is used by Marillac in reference to this queen, would seem to infer that Catherine was not so remarkable for her personal charms as she has been represented by historians, but independently of the acknowledged fact that opinions vary greatly on the subject of female loveliness, Marillac might only mean to qualify his first notice of Catherine when speaking of her from report, in which he says, "The king is going to marry a young lady of the greatest beauty." Marillac's royal master, Francis I, having been much harassed with Henry's requisitions for him to provide him with a consort endowed with perfections such as are seldom to be found in mortal woman, had probably demanded of his accredited spy at the court of England an accurate description of the lady whom his queen-killing friend considered worthy the honour of becoming his next victim. The only authentic portrait of the Howard queen that we have seen is an original outline sketch of her among the Holbein heads in the Royal Library at Windsor. She is there represented as a fair blooming girl in her teens, with large laughing blue eyes and light brown hair, which is folded in Madonna bands on either side of a brow of childlike simplicity. She has a nose retroussé and very full red lips. It is the countenance of an unintelligent little romp trying to assume an air of dignity, and reminds us of a good-humoured Flemish peasant rather than a courtly beauty and a queen. Instead of the slender graceful proportions described by Marillac, she is so plump and round that she appears literally bursting out of her tight bodice, which is made very high and fits closely to her shape. It opens a little in front, and is fastened with a small round brooch. Her head-dress, which is very formal and unbecoming for so young a person, is a small French hood, sitting quite flat to the head with a narrow plaited border. It is possible that Holbein's sketch of Catherine Howard was taken some months after her elevation to the throne, when she might have acquired a considerable degree of embonpoint. If the charms of royalty and power had lulled the young queen into forgetfulness of the precarious tenure, on which these perilous distinctions were held by Henry's wives, she was full soon reminded that the sword was suspended over her own head by a single hair. In the first months of her marriage, mysterious reports in her disparagement were in circulation, for, on the 28th of August, the attention of the Privy Council was called to the fact that a certain priest at Windsor was accused, with others of his company, of having spoken unbefitting words of the queen's grace, for which he and another person had been apprehended. The priest was committed to the custody of Wriothesley, the king's secretary, and the other incarcerated in the keep of Windsor Castle. How alarming any investigation of scandals that might lead to the discovery of those passages in her early life which had been detailed in the preceding pages of this memoir must have been to this queen, may be imagined. With such a secret as she had on her mind, her diadem could have poorly compensated her for the agonizing apprehensions under which she must have writhed, while the examinations were pending. Henry, being in the first intoxication of his bridal happiness, passed the matter lightly over. The priest was simply enjoined to confine himself to his own diocese, and admonished by his majesty's command to be more temperate in the use of his tongue. But the person from whom he had heard the unbefitting words of the queen, which had been unguardedly repeated by him, was confined till further order. It was in all probability this affair that afforded her enemies the first clue to Catherine's early errors, though the cloud passed over for a time. If she had been of a vindictive temper, a severer penalty might have been paid by those who had thus maligned her within the verge of her own court, and measures would have been taken to silence every tongue that ventured to disparage her. After a short sojourn in the silver bowers of Grafton, the court removed to Ampthill. While there the royal household appears to have required reform, for we find that Robert Tyrwhitt, Esquire, the Vice-Chamberlain to the King, and Sir Edward Bainton, Knight, the Queen's Vice-Chamberlain, and divers other gentlemen the King and Queen's servants, to the number of 16, were advertised of the King's pleasure concerning the sober and temperate order that his Highness would have them to use in his Highness's chamber of presence, and also the Queen's, as also the behaviour of themselves toward the King's Privy Council, gentlemen of the Privy Chamber, and all other his Highness's servants of every degree. Catherine could have had little control over such of her attendants as had pertinaciously attached themselves to her fortune. Joan Bulmer was one of her bedchamber women, so also was Catherine Tilney, a person only too well acquainted with her former misconduct, and worst of all, the profligate villain Manox was in her service as one of the royal musicians. At Ampthill the king and queen remained till the 1st of October, after which they withdrew to the greater seclusion of Moor Park, in Hertfordshire, and while there, Henry, being impatient of the slightest interruption or intrusion, issued the following gracious orders, through his privy council, that Queen Catherine's vice-chamberlain and his own, and all the officers of the royal household, that from henceforth they should in no wise molest his royal person with any suit or petition, but cause all suits or supplications to be made in writing, and delivered to his council. The court returned to Windsor October 22nd. At this period reports were in circulation that Henry was about to dismiss Catherine, and reinstate Anne of Cleves in her place, for the repudiated queen was likely to become a mother at a very unseasonable juncture for all parties. Marillac, whom no particle of gossip seems to escape, thus notices these rumours. It is false what has been said about the king leaving the new queen. to take the one whom he has repudiated, for he bestows so many caresses on her he now has, with such singular demonstrations of affection that it cannot be. That which caused the report was, that it has been said the other lady was pregnant, but she has been indisposed." In his next letter to Francis I., dated November 1st, he says, "It is believed that the new queen has entirely gained the favour of the king, and of her who was lately queen they spake no more than if she were dead." Katharine held her court at Windsor rather better than a month. The acts of the Privy Council of November 23rd specify that the king and the queen, accompanied only by the Lord Privy Seal, the Lord Admiral, the Master of the Horse, and the Vice Chamberlain of the Privy Council, and the ladies, gentlemen, and gentlewomen of their privy chamber, departed for Oking, where they remained until the 7th of December, upon which day his highness with the queen's grace departed to Oatlands, and there remained till the 18th of the same month, and upon that day came to Hampton Court. Henry VIII, in his journeys and removals, was on former occasions attended by his council, but here he dispenses with their presence, that he may spend his Christmas at Hampton Court, in the society of Queen Katharine, without the interruption of business or the restraints of royal pomp. The first separation, after a marriage of 6 months, that had occurred between the king and queen, took place February 7, 1541, when the king, for the dispatch of business, removed to London, with his personal attendants, only leaving behind him at Hampton Court the queen's grace, with the whole household. He returned again the 10th day. No sort of pomp or regal splendour distinguished the court of the young and beautiful Howard queen. We find no records of her indulging her love of dress in the purchase of costly robes or jewelry, nor of gifts bestowed on her kindred or favourites. So quiet and unostentatious was the tenor of her life at this period, that the only matter worthy of notice during her residence at Hampton Court is the order to her tailor, dated March 1st, to provide the following needful articles for the use of the venerable Countess of Salisbury, at that time an attainted prisoner in the Tower of London, under sentence of death, and despoiled of all her substance. In premise, a nightgown furred, a kirtle of worsted, and a petticoat furred. Item, another gown of the fashion of a nightgown, of say lined with satin of Cyprus, and faced with satin. Item, a bonnet and a frontlet. Item, 4 pair of hose. Item, 4 pair of shoes and 1 pair of slips, probably slippers. The warm clothing provided for her by Queen Katharine was probably the means of preserving the venerable princess to undergo a fate scarcely less dreadful than that of perishing with cold in her cheerless prison lodgings. Katharine's dower was settled on her by the king's letters patent, previous to the Easter festival, and other grants, licenses, and concessions are secured to her by the same instruments. The whole of the spring and part of the summer were spent by Henry and Catherine in domestic retirement at the country palaces of Greenwich and Eltham, or in making progresses through Kent, Essex, and the Midland counties. If we are to give credit to the assertions, unsupported by proofs, of the majority of historians, Catherine had remained under the political guidance of her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, and Gardiner, Bishop of Winchester, but, as her influence with the king increased, she grew impatient of the tutelage of her uncle, who certainly did not possess the art of conciliating the affections of the ladies of his family, since he was at open variance with his wife, his sister, his daughter, and his stepmother, the Duchess Dowager of Norfolk. It might be that Catherine took part in the quarrel between him and the last named lady, with whom she was certainly on terms of the greatest confidence. But from whatever cause their disagreement arose, it was highly imprudent of the queen, who was naturally an object of jealousy and distrust to the Protestant party, to deprive herself of the protection and support of her powerful kinsman. The event afforded a striking exemplification of the divine proverb, that a house divided against itself cannot stand. Catherine, in the pride of youth and beauty, and blinded by her boundless influence over the mind of a royal husband, forgot, perhaps, that the throne to which his capricious passion had exalted her was based on the graves of 3 of her predecessors, and that it was only too likely to prove in her own case, as in that of Anne Boleyn, a splendid ascent to a scaffold. she imagined that while she was all powerful with Henry, she might defy the rest of the world. The whole realm was then split into two great parties, so nicely matched, as to strength and numbers, that the ruling balance was in the hand of the sovereign, to dispose according to his own pleasure. It was that power which rendered Henry VIII. A despotic monarch, and enabled him to trample on the boasted laws and liberties of Englishmen with impunity. Catholics and Protestants had succumbed alike to his evil passions, and endeavoured to use them as political weapons in their struggles with each other for mastery. The contest had commenced when Henry's divorce from Catherine of Aragon was first agitated, and the Protestant party supported the interests of Anne Boleyn. 5 years had passed away since these rival queens had vanished from the arena, and yet the names of Anne and Catherine were still the watchwords of the warring parties, for Henry was again the husband of 2 living wives of those names, and the legality of his divorce from the Protestant queen Anne, and his marriage with the Catholic Katherine, was almost as much questioned by his Protestant subjects as his divorce from Catherine of Aragon and his marriage with Anne Boleyn had been by the Catholics. Thus we see that Catherine Howard was regarded by the Reformed party in much the same light as Anne Boleyn had formerly been by the Catholics. It was fondly imagined by such of the former, who regarded Anne of Cleves as Henry's lawful queen, that he might be won to a reconciliation with her, if he could be convinced of the unworthiness of her fair successor to fill her place. That the Duke of Cleves was so persuaded, we have shown in the preceding memoir, and it is a fact that throws some light on the diplomatic tact with which the political leaders of that party had organized their plans for the downfall of Catherine Howard. The early follies of Catherine were known to too many not to have reached the persons most interested in destroying her influence with the king, and if they delayed striking the blow that was to lay her honours in the dust, it was only to render it more effectual. The snake was to be killed, not scorched. A crisis at length arrived, which afforded a favourable opportunity for carrying the project into execution. There was a Catholic insurrection in Yorkshire this spring, headed by Sir John Neville. Henry, attributing this to the influence of Cardinal Pole, gave orders for the execution of the venerable Countess of Salisbury, his mother, who had lain under sentence of death in the Tower for upwards of a 12-month. Her sentence had been basely and illegally procured by Cromwell just before his own arrest for treason. His execution, and probably the influence of the new queen, had thus long delayed the headsman's axe from descending on the guiltless victim. She was the last of the Plantagenets, and, with a spirit not unworthy of her mighty ancestors, refused to submit to any unjust sentence by laying her head upon the block. "So should traitors do," she said, "but I am none, and if you will have my head, you must win it as you can." A scene of horror followed, which was concluded by the ruffian minister of Henry's vengeance, dragging the aged princess by her hoary hair to the block, where he slovenly butchered her, and stained the scaffold from veins enriched with the royal blood of England. Henry's mistrust of the Catholic party, in consequence of the late insurrection, induced him to leave administration of affairs in the hands of an anti-papal council headed by Cranmer, Audley the Lord Chancellor, and Seymour Earl of Hertford, the brother of the late Queen Jane, when he proceeded on his journey into Yorkshire. Queen Catherine was the companion of his journey. They left London early in July, passed some days in the palace at Grafton, and so travelled through Northampton and Lincolnshire to York. The progress was attended with some degrees of splendour, but more of terror. Henry was received by his subjects on the road as a destroying angel, ready to inflict the vengeance of heaven on the counties implicated in the late revolt. As the best propitiation they could devise, the men of Lincolnshire offered him money in all the towns through which he passed with his fair young queen. Probably he would not have been appeased without blood also, if she who possessed the art of charming fury passions had not been at his side. In Yorkshire, the king and queen were met by 200 gentlemen of the shire, in coats of velvet, with 4,000 tall yeomen and serving men, who on their knees made a submission by the mouth of Sir Robert Bowes, and gave the king £900. Catherine witnessed a pageant of no less interest, when the Archbishop of York, with upwards of 300 ecclesiastics in their attendance, met the king on Barnesdale, and made a like submission with a peace offering of 600 Like submission was made by the mayors of York, of Newcastle, and of Hull, each of whom gave the king 100 In the course of their progress, Katharine held a court at her dower manor of Shire, which, in memory of that circumstance, is still called Queen's Hold. It was during this fatal progress that Katharine, when at Pontefract Castle, sealed her own doom by admitting her former paramour, Francis Derham, into her household, as a gentleman in waiting and private secretary to herself. Sharon Turner, following Lord Herbert and some other writers, says, that Derham was only employed on 2 or 3 occasions in the absence of the queen's secretary to write her private letters. When we reflect on the nature of some of the letters the unfortunate Katharine was in the habit of receiving, we may readily suppose she preferred the dreadful alternative of employing Derham as her amanuensis rather than a person unacquainted with her fatal secret. It is a doubtful point whether the mysteries of writing, and consequently of reading letters, were among the accomplishments of this ill-fated queen. Joan Bulmer's epistle, previous to the royal marriage, claims Katharine's grateful remembrance, on the grounds of having exercised her clerkly skill in her service when but a private gentlewoman, and it is certain that no letter written by Katharine can be found. Even her signature has been vainly sought at the State Paper Office and elsewhere. The Duchess of Norfolk has been accused of having introduced Derham herself into her granddaughter's court. It is possible that this was the case, since neither of these unhappy ladies had the moral courage to put a stern negative on his audacious demand of preferment if he insisted upon it. Katharine had been married upwards of 12 months before this appointment was granted, the date of which, according to Holinshed, was the 27th of August. On the 29th of the same month, her cousin, Thomas Culpeper, had a long private interview with her at Lincoln, in her closet, or privy chamber, at 11 at night, no one being present but Lady Rochford, her principal lady in waiting, by whom he was introduced. The conference lasted many hours, and at his departure the queen presented him with a chain and a rich cap. This secret meeting, and the unseasonable time at which it took place, was afterwards construed into a proof of a criminal intimacy between the queen and her kinsman. But if Katharine had really been engaged in an intrigue with this near relation, she would scarcely have hazarded bringing him and Derham in contact, knowing, as she did, the jealous temper and lawless character of her seducer. Culpeper was one of the gentlemen of the king's privy chamber, and, in all probability, terrified at the peril in which the queen was involving herself by the appointment of Derham to an office in her household, sought and obtained a private audience for the purpose of remonstrating with her on the subject. This was, in fact, the part that every faithful kinsman would have taken, if aware of the nature of the previous connection between her and Derham. The king and queen arrived at York about the 14th of September, and tarried there 12 days. Great preparations had been made for the reception of Henry's nephew, James V. of Scotland, but that prince, placing no reliance on his uncle's principles, excused himself from accepting his invitation to meet him there. Henry and Katharine quitted York September 26, and that night they supped and slept at home, an ancient moated mansion, which had been recently forfeited to the crown by the rebellion of Sir Robert Constable. On the 1st of October they reached Hull, where they remained 5 days, and crossing the Humber, they pursued their homeward route through Lincolnshire. In one of the letters from the council with the king to that in London, Mr. Secretary Wriothesley writes, "The king and queen and all the train be merry and in health." In the course of this progress, Katharine enjoyed more of the pomp and pageantry of royalty than had fallen to her lot since her marriage with the king. The truth was, they travelled at the expense of the wealthy aristocracy of those counties which, having been recently involved in rebellion, omitted nothing that was likely to conciliate the offended sovereign. Henry, who had become every day more enamoured of his beautiful young queen, took great delight in displaying her to his people in his public entrances into the principal towns in their route, and omitted nothing that was likely to give her pleasure. Katharine, being of a plastic age and temper, readily adapted herself to his humour, and made it her study to amuse and cheer him when he came to her fatigued and harassed with the cares of state. The increase of her influence during this progress was beheld with jealous feelings by those who were naturally desirous of destroying her credit with the king, and the circumstance of the royal travellers resting one night at the house of Sir John Gorswick, who had, during the preceding spring, denounced Cranmer in open parliament as the root of all heresies, was sufficiently alarming to that primate. There was, moreover, a select meeting of the privy council, at which Gardiner presided, held at Gorswick's house, affording strong confirmation to the assertions of Burnet and Rapin that Cranmer had reason to believe that he should very shortly follow Cromwell to the scaffold, unless some means were found of averting the gathering storm. At this momentous crisis, the archbishop communicated to his colleagues, the Earl of Hertford and the Lord Chancellor, the particulars of the queen's early misconduct in the house of the Duchess of Norfolk, which had been conveyed to him by John Lascelles, brother of the vile woman who had connived at the indiscretions, and finally the guilt of the unhappy girl. This disclosure was stated to have taken place in a conversation between Lascelles and his sister, in consequence of his advising her to ask for a place in the queen's household, as others had done, to which Mary replied, that she did not wish to enter into the service of the queen, but that she pitied her. Why so? asked Lascelles. Mary, replied the other, because she is light both in conditions and living, and then she related the tale of Catherine's lapse from virtue with Durham in revolting terms. Alas, for the motherless child who had in the most perilous season of woman's life been exposed to the contaminating society of such a female. The disclosure was regarded by the Earl of Hertford and the Lord Chancellor as a matter proper to be laid before the king, and the task was deputed to Cranmer. End of section 21.